a long career, I slowly began to transform myself into a biologist working on biological problems. The subject of my presentation this afternoon is on a single word, that's the word evolution. And in my opinion now, among all the words in English, probably the one that you need to understand the best is the word evolution. If you understand the word evolution, then you might understand why the world is the way it is. Now, this slide has two figures on either side. These are the pillars of biology and chemistry. If I were asked to name a single pillar on which an entire discipline rests, for biology I would choose Darwin and natural selection, and for chemistry I would choose Mendeleev and the periodic table. Both these pillars were erected in the mid-19th century, especially between the periods of the 1850s to the 1860s. Many years later, the theoretical physicist Jacob Bronowski wrote this. He was talking about the evolution of the elements. Where do the elements of Mendeleev's periodic table form? The only place where elements are formed are in the stars. And he said in all the stars there are going on processes which build up the atoms one by one into more complex structures. Then he says, matter itself evolves. The word comes from Darwin and biology, but it is the word that changed physics in my lifetime. What he really meant was that the revolution in physics which took place in the 20th century, in the first 35 to 40 years of the 20th century, really came from our understanding of matter and the manner in which it changes. I brought this slide along because at the end of February every year we have a public celebration of science. We are very used to doing public celebrations, and shortly after the celebration is over, we go back to normal activities without worrying about anything. Now, if you go to a school and you're trying to talk about science, one of the most difficult questions that you're asked as a scientist is when a small child gets up and asks, what is science? Now, it's hard to define what is science. And the only definition that I can think of is that science is the study of nature. But if you tell a child that science is the study of nature, then of course the follow-up question comes immediately, what is nature? And so now you have to define nature. The word nature is not very easy to define. The journal Nature, which most of you would have heard of, began in 1869. It's today one of the most prestigious journals of science. And in 1869, in the very first volume, volume 1, number 1, the people who started Nature decided that they must have an editorial which announced the new journal. So they asked the famous biologist Thomas Huxley to write the editorial. Huxley was now defining nature, but he did not write the editorial. Instead, what he did was he translated from the German an essay written by the German poet von Goethe in the 18th century. And what Goethe said was this. He said that nature, we are surrounded and embraced by her, powerless to separate ourselves from her, and powerless to penetrate beyond her. In a university, this is something that is worth saying, because that means that every subject that you study in a university, you're studying nature. When you study human beings and their behavior, if you study psychology or sociology or human history or language or whatever you have, you're still studying nature. There are different ways of doing science. The two pillars of the 19th century, Darwin and Mendeleev, illustrated the first way, that you observe and you classify. Both of them did that. Mendeleev observed the elements coming on one by one into the literature, and Darwin observed nature on his trip to the Galapagos Islands. There's a second way of doing science, and that is you do something, you do an experiment. You mix two things together, you do any experiment that you like, and then you observe. That way was really pioneered by Louis Pasteur, also beginning in the middle of the 19th century. And Pasteur is the person who gave us this famous quote, "Chance favors the prepared mind." So if you're doing an experiment, it is what I would call you're messing around. And when you're messing around, something will happen. And a lot of science has come this way. On the eve of February 28th, which is the day that Raman discovered the new form of light scattering, which we call the Raman effect today, what was he doing? He was simply shining light on organic liquids and asking the question, what is the scattered light look like? He discovered that it had a slightly different frequency from that of the incident light. The little difference in frequency corresponded to a small difference in energies, and that corresponds to an absorption by the molecules of the organic liquid. He had discovered a new phenomenon. Not only had he discovered a new phenomenon, but when he discovered it in 1928, it was in fact a direct experimental demonstration of quantization, and therefore quantum mechanics had its first experimental demonstration. There have been many exemplars of experiment and observation. No one better than Michael Faraday. Faraday, you will remember, demonstrated that famous connection between electricity and magnetism, two different areas of physics. Even when I studied physics in the 1960s, we had a separate paper on electricity and a separate paper on magnetism. We didn't really know that they were connected a century earlier. But what Faraday showed was that if you had a current flowing in a circular coil, then you really developed a magnetic field perpendicular to this. And then if you had a rotating magnet, you could now get a current in a coil placed close by, and this showed that there was a connection between the two. The ideas of fields, everything began to emerge from this experiment. But I must tell you that this experiment is the experiment that I see most often performed now with available kits whenever you go to a school exhibition. I'm called upon to inaugurate many school exhibitions of science, and when I go there I find that every other child is demonstrating Faraday's experiment, which is an easy one to demonstrate. But Faraday's experiment has another very important achievement to its credit. Not many of you would know which is the first one-way street in the world. You need a lot of traffic before you declare a street as a one-way street. Bangalore today is full of one-way streets. In fact, you sometimes can't go back to where you came from because you don't know how to get there. And you have to rely exclusively on Google Maps to do all of this for you. The first one-way street in the world is the street in front of the Royal Institution in London. And the Royal Institution in London is the place where Faraday demonstrated his experiments in the middle of the 19th century. And in the middle of the 19th century, there was very little entertainment. And so Faraday constituted a major form of entertainment in London. People would come to see the experiments. And the people who came in very large numbers were ladies. They were Victorian ladies who would be dressed in these long gowns and so on. And there were also ladies who would not walk. So they would come in horse-drawn carriages and park in front of the Royal Institution. After some time, the street would be full and jammed. Nobody else could go through. The mayor of London then declared the street a one-way street so that you could come in and park only on one side of the road and leave the rest of the street. So on the eve of Science Day, it is important to realize that the first traffic jam in the world was actually caused by science, so it might be a subject which is worth celebrating. But sometimes if you make an observation, you need to explain it. You need theory to explain this. And you can see that the people who began to give these theories in the way in which we understand it today in modern science, Clerk Maxwell, who unified electricity and magnetism. And what came out of Maxwell's unification of electricity and magnetism? Light. And they realized that light is electromagnetic radiation. Ludwig Boltzmann worked on heat. What is heat? You know things get hot. We knew it for a long time. He's the one who really thought about heat, thought about the motion of atoms, and gave us the idea of entropy and the entire ideas that underpin statistical mechanics. We've had a century of science, the entire 20th century. So these pillars were erected in the 19th and 20th century. The 20th century begins with the picture right at the bottom left of the slide, and you will recognize it if you see that's Planck, Einstein, and that signifies the quantum with which we began the 20th century. Today you will find that the government of India has what is called the National Quantum Mission. The quantum is 125 years old. In 1925, last year we celebrated the centenary, Werner Heisenberg wrote the paper which really marks the beginning of quantum mechanics. Now I wouldn't put this here because I'm supposed to be talking to a chemistry audience, but I put it there because of what Dirac said some years later. Paul Dirac, one of the most important theoretical physicists of the 20th century, said that the underlying physical laws necessary for the mathematical theory of a larger part of physics, you should read carefully, a larger part of physics and the whole of chemistry are thus completely known. So in fact, quantum mechanics explains all of chemistry, doesn't explain all of physics. There are still problems with it. But chemistry requires quantum mechanics, and within the first 45 years, I take 45 because that was the year of the atomic explosion, everything being done. The physics revolution was over. The field was set now for the new revolution in biology. And in 1943, Oswald Amerie discovered DNA. And once he discovered DNA, you can see everything else that happened, the double helix and so on, the entire revolution in biotechnology, so that you end the century in the year 2000 with the human genome sequence having been announced. This is all of science, chemistry, physics, biology. I make a case for chemistry. Chemistry is not a very popular subject, and it turns out that if you switch on Google, you'll find a little conical flask up there. I wondered what this little conical flask is doing, and so I clicked on it, and that's the great advantage of today's computers. You can just click on something and something else appears. What appeared was this, that it says meet AI mode, a whole new way to search. So artificial intelligence now has at its symbol on Google the humble conical flask, what we call the Erlenmeyer flask. It also turns out that this flask is a very distinguished flask because it will appear everywhere. Chemistry is also very important in the current context, especially 2025, which has just ended, really marks why chemistry is important. Today, no subject dominates geopolitics as much as chemistry. The molecule which started the trouble between the United States and Canada, which is fentanyl, which is a drug, an opioid, that of course now is a key to all the problems which we have with drugs entering the United States. There are other molecules, but I put fentanyl there because Mr. Trump kept talking about fentanyl at the beginning. And then of course more recently, the part of the periodic table which students don't like to see, I certainly didn't like to see it when I was a student. That is the part where you have the lanthanides, the rare earth elements and the actinides. That's a terrible part of the periodic table. At least the other parts of the periodic table look interesting, but this is really dull. But they are the most valuable elements now for technology. And therefore everybody is looking for it. Maybe there are rare earths under the Ukrainian soil. Maybe there are rare earths under the Greenland soil. And so now Mr. Trump is looking for rare earths. So chemistry is a subject which is worth understanding, because if you want to look for rare earths, you must actually pull them out of the ground. And then you must process them to get high purity rare earths. This is not done easily. And this certainly cannot be done in India today without a great deal of investment. And one must therefore be prepared for that. But the biochemist Arthur Kornberg long ago wrote an article which I liked very much, in which he called chemistry the lingua franca of the biological and medical sciences. And this is something that you might think about, that you can't really understand almost anything in biology, and your understanding of medicine would be a lot better if you appreciated a significant amount of chemistry. And one of the problems in Indian education, of course, in medical education, is the complete absence of any treatment of chemistry at any given point. And I will not excuse the chemists from this. In fact, the chemists also really don't subscribe to this statement. They don't think it has anything to do with medicine or biology. There are two charts. I don't know whether your lecture halls are all done and ready, but if you have a biochemistry chart, you will put the chart on the left, which is the metabolic chart. All the reactions which are going on inside your cells. Without all these reactions going on, you won't be living. And biochemistry is this complex subject of this interlocked set of reactions. In fact, the kind of network that you see of chemical reactions is the kind of networks that, for example, are somewhat understandable to electrical engineers who think in terms of networks. And I call these the highways, crossroads, streets and bylanes of cellular chemistry. If any step goes haywire, then there's a problem. You can't afford a traffic jam on any of these highways. And if you do, you have pathology, you have disease. That's an over 100-year-old chart which I found somewhere of periodic table of the elements. And it's been around a long time. And this tells you the constituents of matter. And so finally, when you think about it a little bit, you will be convinced that science is only the study of matter, nothing else. You either study matter which is living, then you're doing biology, medicine and so on, or you study matter which is not living, in which case you're doing some other subject, chemistry, physics. Materials are everywhere. So matter is our central theme. Now one can ask this question, we've come a long way, we're very sophisticated. We know how to talk, we know how to walk, we know how to read, we understand, we reason and so on. We have evolved. Where did we come from? Where did everything that you see around you come from? This is a question which you would rather not ask, because the way this is solved is, we usually say everything was created in one grand moment by some creator. That, of course, then becomes the subject of religion. On the other hand, if you say that where did everything come from, then you have a time scale over which everything has slowly evolved. That is why the word evolution is so important. This is the timetable of evolution. I've borrowed these horizontal bars from this paper in Science Advances by a geophysicist, where he divides the age of the Earth. The Earth is 5.67 billion years old. The dating today is reasonably accurate. That is 567 million years old, and 5.6 billion goes on, and you can see that at the beginning when the Earth was formed, what do you think the Earth would have looked like? The Earth would have looked like a molten rock, spherical rock. Nothing would be alive under those conditions. There will be no life, it will be lifeless. And on a lifeless planet, when you start, that is what is called the Hadean age. This is because everything is boiling and all kinds of things are happening. The geology of the earth has to settle down. Two subjects come to mind immediately which must start everything: geology and chemistry. Anybody who's starting a new university must ask, which are all the subjects that need to be learned if we are to understand all of this. It is not all the subjects which students want to take, no. It's those subjects which everybody needs to learn if they want to address questions. Geology and chemistry come first if you want to understand the origin of life. But chemistry must now, biochemistry is very complex chemistry, and I'll show you that in a moment. You need to put all these chemicals together to make living cells. So biochemicals must evolve. And microbiology comes first among all the biological sciences, because the first organism must be a single cell microorganism. And small microorganisms can be very powerful. I'll pause here for a moment and ask you a question. How many of you were infected with the coronavirus during the pandemic? Good, you've put up your hands. And some of you didn't put up your hands, but I'm 100% sure that you were infected with the coronavirus without your knowing it. Now just think about it. 90 nanometer particle, a virus, paralyzed the world for 2.5 years and brought everything to a total and complete standstill. That pandemic alone should be enough to convince you that biology is a very powerful weapon. And it turns out that two of the subjects which are most popular in India among everybody, and they're quite popular in Kerala too, very popular I would say, politics on the one hand and religion on the other. Neither of these could do anything to the coronavirus. The coronavirus came, evolved, equilibrated, and Darwinian evolution actually happened. That was Darwinian evolution in action. Where did it come from? We don't know. But, so microbiology is the beginning. A virus is not an autonomously living organism. It needs a host. On the other hand, a bacterium can live scrounging things from the environment for food. Microbiology comes first, and that comes around 3.5 billion years ago. But for 1 billion years afterwards, nothing happens. So in fact, you will find for 2.5 billion years, only microorganisms have lived on Earth, nothing else. Even after that, we have a major invention. Today, the most popular word in India is the word innovation. Evolution does innovation. And one of the most important innovations of biology is the invention of photosynthesis. Harnessing the energy of light to make organic nutrients. That results in the oxygenation of the atmosphere, and therefore for the next 2 billion years, you have cells which are growing, but these are now cells which breathe, which use aerobic respiration or oxygen. The first animals come only around 500 million years ago. So it has taken 5 billion years of evolution to reach the simplest animal in biology. An animal which you won't even recognize as an animal, some construct. Plants haven't appeared. And botany comes later, because plants appear later. In fact, plants are terribly complicated. You wouldn't think so if you looked around Kerala, because it looks so green and nice, but there's photosynthesis going on in abundance. Where do we come? You can see that we don't even mark a dot on this time scale. We are not even 1 million years old. And as we are not more than 30,000 to 40,000 years old. You will imagine that every day the discourse in public is based on differences and worries of things that have happened in the last 3,000 years. These are insignificant on any geological timescale. So that's the timetable of evolution. I go a little quicker. The word evolution now applies to matter in the universe which is evolving. It applies to the earth which is evolving, chemical evolution, biochemical evolution. Then we come to biology, species, and Darwinian natural selection. But it also appears to cultures. So it appears to all the fields of humanities. Culture also evolves. Culture has evolved. It evolves on a different time scale, sometimes a very much faster time scale. Darwin did not think much about the origin of life in 1863, but some 8 years later he wrote a letter to a friend where he was imagining the kind of conditions that might have been present for the formation of the molecules of biology. And he says, but if and only if he could conceive in some warm little pond with all sort of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, then a protein compound was formed. So Darwin now speculating on the origins of biochemistry. Two wonderful definitions of life. Darwin here, of course, says here, he marvels at life. He says, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Jacques Monod, who was more of a foremost molecular biologist, but bacteriologist, but later a philosopher, he actually said that there are living systems, there is no living matter, and no single substance, no molecule, nothing possesses the properties of life. They are present nowhere below the level of the cell. So the initial bacterial cell is really the starting point for all of life. In a way, cells are to biology what atoms are to chemistry. And there's no better way of emphasizing the importance of atoms than to go back to Richard Feynman. Volume 1 of the Feynman lectures has this statement, and he asks, in the 1960s, if in some cataclysm all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? What was the cataclysm that Feynman was thinking about in the 1960s? He was thinking about nuclear war. And everybody was worried about nuclear war. What is the world still worried about? It is still worried about nuclear war, except that we sort of assume that it will not happen. But there is every likelihood that it will happen with the kind of conflicts that go on, and it will be extraordinary. He answers his question. I believe it is the atomic hypothesis. All of matter is made up of atoms. He said, if this realization is known to us, we can build the entire edifice of science all over again. Life has been something that physicists are worried about, and the very first physicist, and maybe the most influential, was Erwin Schrödinger, who wrote this book, What is Life, in 1944. He in fact worries about the gene, because at that time they were wondering what is the structure of the genetic material where information is transferred in biology from generation to generation. And Schrödinger thinks of the gene here. This book was influential in taking many physicists into biology. But at the very time Schrödinger was worrying about it, Oswald Avery had discovered DNA. It turns out that Mendelian genetics, which we know, and Darwinian evolution need to be bridged. We know that in biology, every generation, offspring of parents, have some qualities which resemble their parents. This we know. There is this transmission of characteristics, the phenotype. And Schrödinger's book raised this question. But to understand this, we must also remember that there are lots of chemical complexities in life, and that is why biochemistry is only complex chemistry. Chemistry is a lot simpler than biochemistry. You can see this metabolic pathway. That is the pathway of energy metabolism. You can see the number of chemical reactions which are there, the number of catalysts that have to be there. enzymes, and all of this needs to be done. Searching the internet, I found this quotation. I don't know how many of you study the Krebs cycle, but this gentleman who studied the Krebs cycle wrote this. He says, little kids love dinosaurs, bugs, and exploring the woods. Science doesn't scare them. They find it fun until 9th grade. For me, of all the fear-inducing horrors of 9th grade biology, the monster in the pack, the highest mountain of meaningless memorization is, do you remember this, the Krebs cycle. So if you go back and read the Krebs cycle as a biochemist, you will find that sometimes this is true. But you might ask the question, why is it there? What is the advantage of the cycle? What is the logic of all of this? How has evolution actually come to these solutions to the problem of life? This is important because you're living. You wouldn't be living without all this chemical complexity. Every arrow that you see on this is now governed by kinetics and thermodynamics of reactions. So one has to worry about a lot of chemistry in this. Substrate go to product. You need energy. You need catalysis. You need an enzyme. If you need to make an enzyme, you need to make a gene. And if you want to make millions of molecules, you need lots of genes, lots of enzymes, all of them working in concert at the same time. So it's all very complicated. Almost anything that is important in science is taught somewhere around 10th class. And generally tapers off around 12th class. You will find that we had a controversy 2 years ago when the NCERT decided to remove 2 subjects from the 10th class textbook. One was Darwinian natural selection and the other was Mendeleev's periodic table. Ironically, just before they removed these, I had already made these slides, the first slide particularly. So the 2 topics which I thought were the most important topics for everybody to be worrying about, they decided to remove because they said they were trying to lighten the load on the children. But you will find that, of course, now the NCERT's credibility is tested more, not by Darwin or by Mendeleev, but by the fact that they said some not so nice things about the Supreme Court. So you will find that tomorrow's newspaper will have more on this subject. There's an enzyme which fixes carbon dioxide. Every plant has it. It's the most abundant protein on earth, rubisco. Terrible protein, doesn't do things very well, but it does things which nobody else can do. That is fixation of carbon dioxide. No amount of chemical catalysis is going to allow you to fix carbon dioxide the way photosynthesis does. You need energy. You have to get energy from somewhere. Where does that energy come from? It has to come from the sun, nowhere else. You can also think of all the old organisms which lived before photosynthesis, anaerobes. They are still living in your gut. Your intestines full of them. Anaerobic organisms which don't breathe oxygen at all. The chemical complexities are this. For example, vitamin B12 here, or coenzyme B12, an organometallic compound. Look at the complex structure. It needs 36 enzymes to make it. Or look at that inorganic skeleton there. 4 manganese, 1 calcium, 5 oxygens. That is the heart of the photosynthesis. One of the things that photosynthesis does is it splits water into hydrogen and oxygen, but hides the hydrogens. Doesn't give you the hydrogens as hydrogen molecule. I'm saying all of this to emphasize the fact that biochemistry is important. When the last century was ending and people were writing things about the last century, Sidney Brenner wrote this. He says, I once made the remark that 2 things disappeared in 1990. One was communism, the other was biochemistry, and that only one of these should be allowed to come back. Brenner, of course, had not come to Kerala, and he didn't know that communism is alive and well. But at the same time, biochemistry was giving way to a subject which you have, every university has, and one which I think should slowly be hidden from the academic curriculum, that is biotechnology. because it gives you the false impression that it is a technology. You need a lot of biology before you understand biotechnology and harness the technology for useful purposes. But anyway, biochemistry is coming back. I'll skip over this. These are life's imperatives. Life's imperatives are survival and reproduction. It's a rather harsh biological definition of the meaning of life. Biology finds a living organism useful only until it reproduces. After it has reproduced, it has served its purpose and it can grow. This is true in all of biology. The only place where it is not true is human beings who have now invented various ways why they are very important, even as they live into very old age like I do. And we think about it, we talk about it, but biology has no use for us. What are the ingredients for life? Only two. You need information, which is in the form of your genetic material or DNA, and you need energy. Energy, of course, comes from the sun. With all the food that you eat comes only because of plants and animals, and the animals are around only because of everything else. And therefore we are all parasites on every other organism that exists on the earth. I go past this, so if you come through this timeline of evolution, the most important point at which there is a sudden jump of biochemical activity is photosynthesis. When oxygen evolution enriched the oxygen in the atmosphere. That is what led to the transformation of single-cell bacteria into eukaryotic cells with nuclei. This was a hypothesis by Lynn Margulis in the 1960s, which today is our basis for understanding of how the first eukaryotic cells came. Yeast, for example, which makes alcohol. The global carbon cycle, you learn in 12th class, look at it more carefully now. You can break it down into the two simplest reactions. The one in which with respiration you convert oxygen into water, and the other one in photosynthesis where you convert water into oxygen. These are reactions which can be understood in terms of electrons and protons and hydrogen atoms. And so they're remarkable reactions. But you need all of these biological molecules to be able to do this. But in this process, what happens is that the cycle is completely sustainable. So plants and animals coexist without increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's only one animal species which has increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere with technology, and that is human beings. And that is why we're worrying about climate change. But now I think we don't have to worry about climate change anymore because Mr. Trump has declared that climate change is a hoax. So eventually he will find that science inexorably takes you towards a conclusion which you don't like. And that's what the greenhouse effect was talked about by Arrhenius a very long time ago, because he realized this would happen, because if you get carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it will immediately cause heating. And that's what's happening right now. But if you go back and look at the molecules of biochemistry, you will see some of the most complex molecules, and those cycles and everything have come already early on in evolution. So today one of the questions which I would like to understand is really, why are these things coming so early in evolution? How did they come so early in evolution? And what is the logic of having cycles? There's a very specific advantage in having cyclic systems for chemical reactions. It's the closest thing that you can think of to a perpetual motion machine, going round and round and round. The only thing that I know of which goes round and round and round without actually ending for a very long time are superconducting currents in circular magnets which you use in NMR spectroscopy, for instance. Zero resistance, so electrons keep going round and round and have an electric current. So have a persistent magnetic field. But very rarely do you get something for nothing. But there, in superconductivity, you cool. You need liquid helium to reach those temperatures. So you are expending energy somewhere. I will skip past this because these are technical to some extent, and we won't worry too much about the structures. But even a very complex and terrible chemical structure like coenzyme B12, those of you who may wonder what is B12, B12 is the pink solution which doctors inject into you if you go and tell them that you're feeling fatigued and weak. And if you go the first time, they'll tell you to eat well and take some rest. If you go the second time, they'll give you a shot of B12 and get you out from there. And whether it works or not is a different matter, but it also turns out that it usually works because people think that once they've got an injection which is unpleasant, then something good is bound to happen subsequently. Every part of this molecule is used somewhere else. So effectively the complexity has been built up from simpler systems, and that is what one is trying to understand today. But after oxygen comes, many reactions of biochemistry require molecular oxygen. Those can't happen before. And look at the molecules. Cholesterol can't be made without oxygen. Collagen, which is the most abundant protein in animals, cannot be made without oxygen. Proline needs to be converted to hydroxyproline. Lignin, which is the main material of trees outside, that cannot be made without oxidative phenolic couplings, and therefore you need molecular oxygen in those reactions. Photosynthesis is the one single innovation of nature which resulted in all complex life on Earth. Without photosynthesis, we would have all still been anaerobic bacteria. One single oxygen atom in a complex chemical structure. And you might ask the question, where did that oxygen come from? It can come only from two places. One from molecular oxygen, the other from water. Nowhere else. Konrad Bloch was asked this question by his postdoctoral supervisor, can you find out where this oxygen comes from? He spent the next 20 years working out the biosynthesis of cholesterol, which then became the classic for which he got the Nobel Prize many years later. But it is a fundamental question. Why is cholesterol important? I won't tell you all of this. Go quickly past. Maybe go back to this one. Cholesterol is important because cholesterol is the basis of the steroid hormones. The steroid hormones are the sex hormones. Membrane fluidity in cells is modulated with cholesterol. Bile salts in your gallbladder come from cholesterol. And vitamin D, which is essential for making your bones, also comes. So none of us would exist unless the cholesterol biosynthesis pathway had been discovered by nature. And in order to discover the cholesterol biosynthesis pathway, it needed molecular oxygen. And in order to get molecular oxygen, it needed to invent photosynthesis. So there is a progression of these events, and even current literature now looks at these things in somewhat greater detail. But oxygen, it's there in the 12th class textbook, because I've checked this out, because students don't like to be told about oxygen because they've heard about it in 12th class. But this is the 2017 paper in the Journal of the American Chemical Society. I made it because it's 2017 Journal of the American Chemical Society. Author is a Nobel laureate, Roald Hoffmann. And this is what he says. We can burn, and not just with passion, but of course we do not burn. Nice sentence. The editors would not have allowed one of us to write the sentence, but Hoffmann is permitted to write these kinds of sentences. What is the question he's asking? Oxygen is a hugely reactive molecule, yet it doesn't spontaneously react because large activation barriers prevent it from reacting. So this is the kind of molecule which is called a thermodynamically activated but kinetically persistent molecule. That means it lasts. We are breathing in oxygen all the time. And remember, if you breathe in oxygen all the time, you have a finite lifespan. Because you slowly get oxidized. Aging is the fact that you're slowly getting oxidized over the years. If you get into a hospital and they give you oxygen, Even for a patient who really is struggling, they'll give pure oxygen only for a short while. They won't keep the patient on pure oxygen for a very long time. We have no choice but to be it. So there you are. In 2025, people still worry now about getting better and better data. This is because of the advances in geophysics, in dating, where methods from physics or dating have become better and better and better. You can go back in time. Many molecules of oxygen. But last thing that I'll tell you is you need, for example, energy. And the way cells make energy is to make an energy-rich molecule ATP. The synthesis of ATP is a very complicated process. A membrane is needed and a proton gradient across the membrane is needed. This was a hypothesis posed in the 1960s by Peter Mitchell. And in the year 2000, you'll find that essay there. Mitchell received the Nobel Prize in 1978, a very controversial piece of work. It says, "Are you serious, Dr. Mitchell?" And it is a good question, because Mitchell suggested that energy-rich molecules are made by first creating electrochemical energy across an impermeable membrane. And therefore you have one side positive, the other side negative, you build up an electrochemical potential, and then you discharge this electrochemical potential with a proton gradient and use that as energy transduction to drive an energetically unfavorable process. That is the transfer of electrons from molecule to molecule and eventually to oxygen. Oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. And in respiration, oxygen is only the terminal electron acceptor. It isn't very important. If you're in an anaerobic world, you can have other molecules as electron acceptors in this kind of redox process. Albert St. Georgi, the man who discovered vitamin C, said this very nicely. He says, life is nothing but an electron looking for a place to rest. Today, when the most advanced techniques of cryo-electron microscopy have begun to reveal the structures of these molecules, you will find that there are iron-sulfur clusters separated by approximately the same distance. That distance corresponds to the de Broglie wavelength of the electron. So physics, chemistry and biology actually come to rest together in the electron transport. Iron sulfur clusters are also present in minerals, exactly the same cluster, which means that origins of life would really have happened when you had inorganic analogues of what we today call living systems. And slowly the transformation converting inanimate matter into animate matter, which is the first bacterial cell, would have happened a long time ago, possibly in deep sea thermal vents. Mitchell's hypothesis for making ATP has been described as the most counterintuitive idea in biology since Darwin, and the only one to make comparison with the ideas of Einstein, Heisenberg and Schrödinger. Biology does not have many counterintuitive ideas. Quantum mechanics remains counterintuitive even today. There's nothing counterintuitive in chemistry. Biology has two counterintuitive ideas: Darwinian natural selection and Mitchellian chemiosmosis, which is the basis of energy transduction. This is Mitchell's paper in 1961. Only two drawings, the two of them made by hand, nothing, no calculations, nothing, just an idea. And then he says at the very end, thus we might be inclined to recognize that transport and metabolism, as usually understood by biochemists, may be conceived advantageously as different aspects of one and the same process of vectorial metabolism. All he's saying is sometimes you need energy to push things across a membrane, but at other times you might use that to produce energy in the reverse direction. That is, metabolism can now produce energy. So there you are. The last universal common ancestor at the root of the tree of life. what is called LUCA today. Lots of research going on trying to understand what LUCA might have looked like. We should all have some interest in this because LUCA would be our ancestor, the ancestor of all of us, and therefore we are all descended from the last universal common ancestor, which was a single cell organism. Darwin wrote that as the tree of life. That's Mendeleev writing his periodic table. From this, all of the last 150 years of science or 200 years of science have really come about. Jacob Bronowski wrote a book called The Ascent of Man. This is based on a BBC series. I want you to only think of one thing, the title, The Ascent of Man. What does it mean? The ascent of man means man has improved over the centuries. Man, of course, is used to include women, which is only in a literary sense. And the ascent of man is man has got gradually better. That is, but it turned out that what is this process? This is a process of cultural evolution. And as this cultural evolution takes place, what is at the basis of cultural evolution? It is technology. Look at the technologies that have spurred human evolution. The invention of fire, the invention of the wheel, transportation, communication, the invention of the printing press, books, and now, of course, for most of you, the invention of computers, smartphones, the rest of it, and now what everybody believes will now transform our existence. I hope to live to see it. That is artificial intelligence. And you can also imagine in what I tell you where it will lead to. Culture evolves, and this is becoming a legitimate subject of science. Cultural transmission is more complex than genetic transmission, and may occur on shorter time scales, even within a single generation. It has happened in my generation, if I knew it. There was no computer, there was no cell phone, nothing when we started. Now we are addicted to cell phones. Even I look at it all the time like this, and my habits have changed. But you might ask a reverse question, and that's the better question to ask. Will cultural evolution affect biological evolution? I want you to ask this question in the context of all this, what I sometimes call nauseatingly repetitive imagination of what artificial intelligence is going to do over the next few years. Cultural traits can sometimes influence biological traits, and it happens over time. There's one example in the literature. There's a second which is not 100% proven. The ability to tolerate milk. Human beings never drank milk before the invention of agriculture. The invention of agriculture is one of the major transformations in human cultural evolution. Human society is formed because of agriculture. Without agriculture, we won't stay in one place, we'll be hunting for food all over the place in small lands. Once that happened, animal husbandry, when it was milk became a possible nutritional product. But all mammals, we are mammals, all mammals stop drinking milk after weaning from the mother. Only human beings drink milk after weaning from the mother. And the reason they do this is they become acclimatized to using it. What does this acclimatization really mean? That means all your ancestors and mine who drank milk and who did not have the enzyme lactase, which breaks down lactose into glucose, suffered from serious indigestion. They would have had diarrhea and died of dehydration. But a small population in any human population will now have what is called the persistence of the lactase gene expression after the first 6 months after birth. That gene shuts off. In these what I would call mutant individuals, you now are selecting out a mutant population. They are the lactase persisters. And once the lactase persisters persist, they multiply. Today we worry about antibiotic resistance, exactly the same problem. So the lactase persisters have been more in Scandinavia, and the lactase persisters are very few in South Africa. If you go from North India to South India, North Indians have many more lactase persisters in North India, fewer lactase persisters in South India. So it turns out that despite the success of Amul, Nandini and all the local dairies everywhere, it turns out that we were not made to drink. Biology didn't make us to drink. But we drink it very well now and have all those products. This is a result of Darwinian evolution, selection, and slowly enrichment in the genes which give you an advantage in this environment of milk drinking. Harari describes the importance of agriculture in sapiens very well. I like this book very much, so once when I was going somewhere, I bought this, which is a children's version of Harari's book along with illustrations, How Humans Took Over the World. This begins with one sentence question. How did human beings take over the world? It ends with one sentence, by learning to tell stories. It is up to you to read this. I found this fascinating because I bought the book to give to a child whose parents I was going to meet later that evening. And when I read it on the plane, I decided to keep it myself and bought a couple of chocolates on the way out of the airport and gave it to the child instead. I suspect the child appreciated the chocolates very much better than getting the book. So this is what he says. The cognitive revolution is accordingly the point when history declared its independence from biology. Human history before the cognitive revolution is animal history, that's biology. Human history after the cognitive revolution, that is the development of the brain. Remember that 99+% of your genome is the same as the chimpanzee genome. Yet we are different. It's difficult to understand this, but it is true. Then he said from cognitive revolution onwards, historical narratives replaced biological theories. And he says to understand the rise of Christianity or the French Revolution, it is not enough to comprehend the action of genes, hormones and organisms. It is necessary to take into the account the interaction of ideas, images and fantasies. Today we live in an age of mythology. We have rediscovered mythology, and as we rediscover mythology, we must wonder. So there's my time scale. Homo sapiens has appeared right at the end. How long will all of this last? The end is clear. To astrophysicists, the end is clear. That's an astrophysics book. It says the end of everything. Marvelous book. And the outer limit is 10 billion. That's when the energy of the sun dies down. Once the energy of the sun dies down, there's no more photosynthesis. It's all over. But you can imagine, a couple of billion years before the sun's energy dies down, it's going down. Then you will have cataclysmic changes. So you can imagine this. We don't worry about it because it's still several billion years into the future, and those of us who are elected to worry about this have a 5-year time scale. And the rest of us might have a slightly longer time scale to worry about it. We might worry about it over 30 years, 40 years or so. When you're young, you don't have anything to worry about. Now, how will everything end? That's what Katie Mack's book really describes. And she says that she argues that it will end in fire in about 5 billion years. But she also draws attention to this poem written by Robert Frost in 1920, which says, some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. So in a way, the end is clear, but we still haven't understood the beginning. And what one would hope is that we will understand the beginning before the end really arrives. But it is going to take a long time to understand the beginning in any detail. Thank you very much for inviting me and listening to me, and also my acknowledgements. I must give my acknowledgements. These are the two institutions where I spent my career. Indian Institute of Science on the top left. I spent 41 years there, and post my retirement, I have been at the National Center for Biological Sciences. And the wonderful thing about both these institutions is that you can do what you like, and you can think about anything that you like, and you can write what you like, you can say what you like. But then, that was some time ago. Thank you very much.
You are